Oh, now we know that this meeting is also being recorded. 26, we wait another minute and then we can start, I think. So it is 9:03 and I think we can actually start with our session. So good morning and a very warm welcome on this chilly morning actually here in Pretoria, to all our guests, participants and speakers to this morning session of the SaferSpaces conference on preventing violence in South Africa, from policy making to evidence-based implementation. My name is Thomas Hellman and I'm part of the GIZ Inclusive Violence and Crime Prevention Program. I'm focusing mainly on urban safety within the program implementation as a technical advisor. And one of the measures is the BCP initiated initiative called SPRINT, which is Safer Places, Resilient Institutions and Neighbors Together, which aims at upscaling integrated area-based violence prevention interventions and to institutionalize tools for place-based interventions, particularly within local government institutions and selected civil society organizations. And I am very much looking forward to be able to moderate today's session and discuss jointly with you on the topic building resilient communities through infrastructure and environmental design, which is the fourth session of the SaferSpaces conference. Just to recap and really to bring everyone on board, this is the second day of the conference. It's supported by the Civilian Secretariat for Police Service as the host of the SaferSpaces online platform, the Safety and Violence Initiative, which we all know under SAVI from UCT, in cooperation with the German Development Corporation. Yesterday, the conference started off with a session on the importance of evidence-based implementation, and the role of the police in violence prevention. And also lastly, we focused on preventing violence through the promotion of gender equality. In our session, as mentioned before, we will have a closer look at building resilient communities through infrastructure and environmental design for prevention, such as, for example, also the accessibility of quality and safe public spaces. But we will also look beyond the South Africa's spatial and socio-economic characteristics and his history of forced segregation during the Apartheid regime, and discuss the need for area-based violence prevention interventions and how they target the specific demands of a certain community. And to start off with is that if we know from, for example, the police stations that the top 30 police stations or the top 30 most detected violence and crime police stations count up to 20% of all crime detected of more than the 1,150 police stations in the country. I was just checking yesterday again of the murder, the absolute murder within the top 30 stations count up to 4,229 murders, which is in fact a little bit more than 20%. And what can and we actually must do to respond with more targeted and place-based approaches to these challenges and support building resilient communities that look at environmental design, the access to both basic but also social infrastructure. And we want to discuss how do we sustain infrastructure and apply, for example, the principles of crime prevention through environmental design, but also how then on the other side, social crime prevention and law enforcement come into play. What are the core lessons and what needs to be done to scale up successful approaches? And to do all this in the next 2 hours, we've invited key experts who will provide us with each a trigger input. And for that, we've invited Tinus Kruger from the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research from the CSIR. We've invited Michael Krauser from the Violence Prevention Through Urban Upgrading, VPU, and as well as Spelele Ngubeza from the South African Cities Network, in particularly from the Urban Safety Reference Group. So before I hand over to today's experts, I would like to quickly go on to the Mentimeter with you to get us going straight into the topic, but also to get to know each other a bit more and knowing who is actually in the virtual room. For that, I would like you to go into menti.com. We will also put this into the chat, menti.com, and then we will have the code 19545316. So let's go on the menti.com, and then the code is 19545316. And I'm going to stop sharing here. And I'm going to start sharing again our Menti. I hope that you can all see this now.
No, not yet.
It's coming. There you go. So the first question is, which sector are you representing? And the code again is menti.com 19545316. So we have at the moment about, I saw 41 participants. And so far I see that most of us come either from government, as well as the research and academia, as well as civil society and the community is also coming up. We'll give it just another few seconds, just for everyone to get a chance to go on menti.com, put in the code 19545316. So we have from government 6, we have civil society 6, as well as research and academia. I think it gives us quite an equalized picture actually. We have 2 from others. Maybe you can put it into the chat where you are from. But other than that, we are pretty equal between all the others, government, civil society, as well as from research and academia. Thank you very much. And I would like to go into the next question, which is, to what extent do you agree to the following statements on area-based violence prevention interventions? So you strongly agree or you strongly disagree with these statements. The first one, place-based interventions are most cost-effective in violence prevention, or place-based interventions take more time than one-size-fits-all intervention. Do you agree to that? And then we have the third one on area-based interventions are unique and therefore difficult to replicate in other areas. And separate initiatives could contribute to the transformation of South Africa's society. So let's see where we are going. The Menti code again, 19545316. Let's give it a minute just to check, to give it a little bit of time where we are going. It looks like that many of us agree that separate initiatives could contribute to the transformation of our society in South Africa. And I believe and I hope that we will go much more into detail, also to unpack that a little bit of what else is required. Many of us do also say that area-based interventions are very unique and difficult to replicate in other areas. Interesting. So we know that we will say that difficult to replicate, just to put it basically into another area, is something that we are not going to be able to do as easy. But we also believe that they do take more time than one size fits all. Okay, I think this gives us an interesting picture to begin with. I'm sure we'll come back in our discussions after our presentations as well. I would now like to hand over to Tinus Kruger. Tinus is the research group leader of the Housing and Urban Studies group at the CSIR. He's registered architect specializing in crime prevention through environmental design. He has studied the relationship between crime and the planning, design, and management of the physical environment since actually, in fact, 1998. And he's also the vice president of the International Septet Association. He is going to provide us with an input on the influence of the physical environment on community safety. I look forward to your presentation, Tinus, and over to you now.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I just want to make sure I've tried to share my screen. Is it visible? Is it visible? Sorry, you were on mute.
It is visible, yes.
There we go. Thank you very much. Thanks, Thomas. And good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to just thank all involved in this webinar and the conference, in fact, for the opportunity to share and to learn, obviously, as well. I've been asked to talk about, and if I can just make sure that this thing moves, the topic that I've been asked to talk about is the influence of the physical environment on community safety. And this topic has two main characteristics or two main areas: the physical environment and the community or people or users of that environment. So I'm going to structure my very brief introduction around these two components. Due to the time constraints, obviously, we can't talk about everything that we've done over the past 20 odd years. So I'm going to provide, hopefully, a few pointers for our discussion. And there will be random issues, just to get us started. I'm going to call them dots, and then hopefully with the discussion and the input from the other speakers, we will be able to connect some of these dots to get a better understanding of what we're talking about. So let me start immediately with the physical environment aspect of this introduction. I'm going to show you a few images, and you will obviously, you'll see them as obvious images. We all know this. These are the basics when we talk about the relationship between crime and the physical environment. I'm going to share them with you just to get the discussion going. And I've grouped them into the areas that we call planning, design, and management principles of the South African interpretation, or the CSIR's interpretation for that matter, of crime prevention through environmental design, or SEPTED as we call it. We've identified them in the Designing Safer Places manual some time ago already, but I think they're still valid. So just as some background about the environment component of crime prevention through environmental design. We know that we would like to see our environments create safety and security for communities. And that's why we try and increase, number one, the opportunities for surveillance and improve visibility. We all know that. And we talk about concepts here such as pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods. We talk about lighting. We talk about mixed use. We talk about eyes on the street. And that's why we think that something like the high walls and the unmaintained areas do not contribute to improving the safety of our neighborhoods and our areas where people live. The next couple of photographs talk about things like territoriality, where we would like people, the environment, to allow people to take responsibility for public space, as opposed to what we sometimes see in the photograph of the abandoned building, where it becomes a no man's land, where no one is responsible for the upkeep, and we know what happens then sometimes in these. The next principle that we try and achieve when we look at the physical environment is that of providing escape routes for people when they feel unsafe. And we know, we look at the photograph at the bottom, that when you walk into that tunnel, you will not feel safe because you will not be able to necessarily escape. These are like the basics of crime prevention through environmental design. We also know that something like good signage and lighting will assist people in providing an escape route. We also do not want people with other intentions to have access to certain areas in a way that will allow them to do something that may be criminal. The next principle of image and aesthetics, I think that's an obvious one. We know that people would like to see areas that are neat, and they do not always feel safe in areas where you can see that a place has been dilapidated. The last one of the principles, unfortunately, is seen by many as the only way of implementing SEPTET, or crime prevention through environmental design, and that's target hardening. It is unfortunate that this one is sometimes seen as equal to crime prevention, because we know that this type of principle, if implemented incorrectly, can result in exclusion rather than the creation of inclusive neighborhoods. And we've seen that in our suburbs particularly. The last sort of like cross-cutting principle is that of maintenance. And that's where, again, we talk about the obvious things that everyone talks about when they talk about SEPTET, which is still true, like cutting the grass and maintaining open spaces. So these are the basics of what we look at when we look at our environment. And these planning, design, and management principles, they're valid. However, we have to look at the community aspect when we implement crime prevention through environmental design, or we look in any way at the relationship between crime and the physical environment. The interaction between the physical environment and people, or the community, or the users, whether legitimate or not, is important. We need to consider that, because the physical environment, as we've now seen, could create opportunities for crime, it could reduce opportunities for crime, and it will, and it could, but it will influence people's behavior. And importantly, when it comes to the environment, it could increase or reduce the fear of crime because of the perceptions that people have. So, in addition to those principles, we need to understand that people or the community should be central to all initiatives where we try and use environmental design to reduce crime. So we also have to adjust and to implementation principles and strategies. And I'm going to very briefly go through them. I know that we don't have a lot of time, but the first aspect to understand and to remember is we need to understand how people use or may want to use spaces, and even more importantly, who they may end up using a space in a way that we did not foresee and have unintended consequences. So we need to, before we start with an intervention, really have a good knowledge of what the community wants and how they're going to use spaces, because the space in itself is not the issue, it's the interaction between people and the physical environment. The next pointer, understand the context and base your understanding on a thorough situational analysis, looking at crime, looking at social aspects, looking at many issues. And we know that we have to understand in South Africa, particularly, the macro context. We know we cannot just bring interventions from other countries into South Africa and say they're going to work here. We know if we just look at the poverty, inequality, and unemployment issues in South Africa, we know we can't do that. However, we also need to look at it at this area-specific realities or place-based interventions, because one intervention may not even be working in a neighborhood. You may have to also even just adjust it according to different contexts. The next one, involve all role players. We know that wherever possible, we need to involve people in a participatory process. We also know, and we've heard this many times, even at this conference, the issue of partnerships. Important to consider that when you look at the environment as well. Then I think the last one here is you need to combine any environmental design intervention with other approaches. We know that we've seen that. You must combine SEPTED with law enforcement, social development, local economic development, because I think we've heard it, unfortunately, in the past, where people say that if you just provide sporting facilities, for instance, you're going to reduce crime. And we know that it doesn't work like that. If you look at the photograph in the middle of, and there's many of them, poor, unfortunate examples where a sporting facility has been provided, but without funding, without programs, without equipment, without community support, these facilities, the physical facility, will not make the difference. If you look at the one on the left, where the community has actually just taken a vacant piece of land and used it, it may even, in some cases, be a better crime prevention initiative than providing a sporting facility. So, we now know that environmental design interventions, in combination with other initiatives, could play a key role in any area-based intervention, in any place-based intervention. But the key here is, let's look at the theme of this conference. How do we move from policy making to evidence-based implementation? That's the key question. We know we have the guidance, we have the tools available. I don't have to tell you, you just have to go to the SaferSpaces website and you'll find 7,522 or something in that. No, I don't know. But there's a lot of information available to assist us. Why has it not changed? And I want to make a statement that we may not all agree with, because it's part of the topic of this conference. I believe that we actually have many communities that are remarkably resilient already. So how do we harness that? How do we use that in combination with our initiatives? So the question then really is, how do we ensure implementation? And I would love to tell you that, but my time is up. So I look forward to the discussion so that we can connect some of these dots and hopefully get to some understanding of how we implement. And then lastly, I want to just mention to you that if you would like to get more information about what's happening in the world at the moment around SEPTED, you're more than welcome to go to the International SEPTED Association website, because we have an amazing conference planned for November. It will be online, coming from Helsingborg in Sweden. Thank you very much.
Mr. Tinus Kruger, thank you very much for your presentation and also for your triggering questions at the end. I'm sure that we are going to come back to that within our joint discussion after our other inputs. With that, I would now like to hand over to Michael Krauser from the Violence Prevention Through Urban Upgrading NPO, who many of you know as the VPOU. The VPOU is an area-based community development organization that aims at safe, sustainable and integrated communities. It strives for the improvement of quality life for residents in their neighborhoods through a comprehensive range of urban improvements and social interventions. It started off already more than 15 years ago, in fact, in Kayalicha, and is now extended with its support to many places in the Western Cape, with National Treasury and other communities throughout the country. Michael Krauser, the CEO of VPOU, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Thomas. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a great honor. Thanks, Tinus, for framing the conversation around the septet. I would like to carry on a little bit along the lines of some theory and then take us straight into an example in an informal settlement. I think we frame our work around the outcome number 3 of the NDP, all people in South Africa are and feel safe. So I think that's a line along the lines of the conference as well. As Thomas said, our vision as an organization is to co-create safe and sustainable neighborhoods to improve people's quality of life. Tinus given similar examples. How do you move from an unsafe place like that into a place that feels safe and where people can actually feel safe? So what are the triggers for that in order to make out of a rubbish dump or an undesired place or backspace something that's appreciated, that's owned? So it's really changing the narrative. And if you come from a violence prevention perspective, we're familiar with the 3 types of violence that are surrounding us. It's a direct violence, and Thomas referred to that in the intro about the crime stats that we're living with, the very high crime stats. But it's also the 2 invisible. That's the cultural violence because of your ethnic background or sexual orientation or gender or whatever. And the structural violence, which is a state which we got a very long tradition, very negative tradition in South Africa of structural violence and excluding, just think about the us and them conversation that we sit in many, many conversations on a daily basis. That's where the state exercise violence towards its citizens. I think I would like to take a little bit narrative further from 1969, move on to a little bit into the new century. And it's looking at what are our divides, what are the challenges for the next couple of years that we are facing. And I think it starts with us. That's really the spiritual divide. The simple answer is, to put it in simple terms, if greed governs our relationship, it is very difficult. If you are governed or if you are driven by greed, it's very difficult to do something for the society, which is really the social divide. Which we got a big problem in South Africa, as we all know. And what's coming up, and I think the conversation, the narrative during COVID and post-COVID will be really about the ecological divide. What are we doing as society towards nature, and are we actually living a sustainable life, and can we survive as human race, and what is the way forward in order to stem that? If you want to go too much, you can read it up. What Duchamp is available with from the ego to the eco, quite helpful. As an organization, many of you know that, so I don't want to repeat a lot. We got a strategy that looks into 4 elements: the prevention, the cohesion, the protection, and the evidence. Building on evidence, the change, and as an organization, we align us very much to the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as to the white paper on safety and security, which is the main policy paper that we're trying to give meaning and sense in our daily work. If you look into the area-based interventions and what makes an area-based intervention an area-based intervention, as Tinus said, the people-centered focus, community needs to be in the center of that. If we want to make any change, we need to take the people along with us. It needs to be evidence-based so that we know whether what we're doing has an impact, and a positive and a desired impact. Many people spoke already, the 2 speakers spoke already about the context specific. So don't try to import external solutions. Do a home build, a context specific, people and space specific intervention. Needs to be multi-sectoral. And that's often where we have difficulties, because it's so much easier to do it by yourself. But working in partnerships, working with other sectors gives you the sustainability. And sometimes it takes a little bit longer, but it's much more in-depth and sustainable. Which leads us to how do we partner with each other, and what kind of partnerships are we working in? And it's really around participatory and process and putting the community and putting the needs of the citizens in the center of it. As an organization, we have developed 3 types or 3 scales of area-based management. I'm looking in particular in the informal, the emerging one. So what are small spaces? What are areas where we want to get a foothold into an area with the area-based approach, with the management? The second one is around a neighborhood center. We call them active boxes. You can see that in the middle. So it's actually this place-making with physical infrastructure. And the third one is on a precinct. And I think there's a lot of conversation around precinct management. How can we make safer spaces? I think a lot of people know that. Just want to train the eye of us a little bit. It's an aerial photograph of any informal settlement here in the Cape Flats. And just look for this urban acupuncture, the emerging one. So you need a guiding coalition, which is your community, and you walk and you talk and you find the solutions, the appropriate solutions. What makes a space a space? It's the provision of water, for instance. I was looking forward to the 4th speaker, which unfortunately is unable to attend, to have that conversation. It's around enabling an environment, is to activate it, in our particular case with early childhood development, and then to sustain it, that operation and maintenance that Tinus was talking about. If we're not maintaining our spaces, we may as well not invest in the spaces. So going back to the picture, how does it find itself in space? We got a walkway. We got one water tap with a micro space, and we got another one with the joy wheel that you saw earlier on. So that's connecting the urban acupuncture. And even in informal settlement, you can see that emerging piecing, that emerging area-based management coming through. On the level of an active box, you can see now we're starting the micro piecings. You have a safe public space, you've got an active box, you've got your neighborhood center. You probably added with an ECD, early childhood development, probably with a playground. And in the times of COVID, what we pushed really hard as VPU is to give to bridge the digital divide. So we put, for instance, that in the same informal settlement, we connected all the ECDs with Wi-Fi. Obviously, that's like less contact of people. It allows people to access information online, offline in our particular case. And it immediately bridges the digital divide by providing public service into the public infrastructure. I hope you can still hear me, because I think we're going into load shedding right now. In terms of monthly users, you can see the uptake, and those are 2 areas, Hara and Monroe BC Park, where we have been working for the last 10 to 15 years. And you can see that uptake. During COVID, we increased significantly the access to Wi-Fi. You can see we got now average on March of 7,000 to 8,000 people. We are currently sitting at 30,000 people, monthly unique users through the network. That network obviously enables you then also to look at what you call smart urbanism. It's urbanism or smart urbanism with a social intent, quite slightly different to smart cities. And it's often big data. And in our cases, it's around monitoring water taps and toilets. Again, a project that got scaled to 20 informal settlements during COVID, so that the city, in our particular case, City of Cape Town, was able to respond to citizens' needs. It's around knowing who sits and lives in informal settlements. And it's also about the general, the regular household surveys to understand, to create that evidence base, what are the interventions that we do have the desired impact. So that brings you a little bit to that precinct in a particular area. And if you now look at scale, and you take those little M2Js or those little public spaces and you connect them, and you connect the active boxes, and it may be a waste station, it may be an early childhood development center, it may be a sports field, etc., etc. If you start connecting the dots, as Tina said, we want to connect the dots and give some input for conversation, you start to work on a systemic level. And again, sort of, you start looking at safe public spaces, you're looking at public health and the quality of life, and you start bridging those divides. You're starting to nag on on the different types of violence. It's your structural violence that you start to address, as well as access to services. And you're starting to look into the social and economic sustainability, because jobs are created. So what we're aiming for, and what I'm aiming for, and what I'm propagating is, if you do an intervention, start small, prototype it. If it's successful, scale it up. If it's unsuccessful, go back and reiterate the prototyping until you got a prototype that you can scale. And once you scale, then you see the impact as well. So I'm mindful of scaling interventions, half-cooked interventions, if they're not properly prototyped. And that takes time sometimes, and that requires an openness of all partners, the citizens, the professionals, the civil society, as well as the public sector. I hope I've given a little bit of points for the discussion later on. So thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much, Michael, also for your input. Indeed, it gave us quite some points for discussion that we would like to reiterate later on. I really liked also your last comment on starting small and test it further. And if it doesn't work, we need to start again and improve. I think there is quite a number of discussions that we can go much deeper within our discussions. Before we do that, I would like to hand over now to Spelele Ngobese from the South African Cities Network. She's a researcher on the inclusion and well-being component within SACN. She's also the secretariat for the Urban Safety Reference Group, which is our peer-to-peer learning network amongst the biggest cities for practitioners on violence and crime prevention interventions. And she's going to give us an input on the integrated public service delivery for safety. Over to you, Spe, and we look forward to your input.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting us and having us. You've done a great job of introducing us already, so I won't dwell too much on who we are. Yes, we cooperate with the GIZ Inclusive Violence and Crime Prevention Program under the agreement between the German Cooperation in South Africa and COGTA. And we are the Urban Safety Reference Group, and one of the few, if not only in the Southern African region, structured platforms for practitioners and experts, as well as national department players with a role in urban safety, where we come together, share practices, learn, exchange, and so on. I'm happy to share this presentation for those who would like to read in more detail about who we are and how we come together. So just in terms of, again, I won't dwell long, our policy context and some of the things that inform what we do, of course, the Integrated Urban Development Framework, the White Paper on Safety and Security, at the global level, New Urban Agenda, and more recently, the United Nations System-Wide Guidelines on Safer Cities and Human Settlements, and some of the instruments and partnerships that really drive what we do, that anchor our emphasis on evidence, data, and the sharing of learnings and practices and so on. So I'll move right on. In terms of how we see and our advocacy around why safety matters is that metros, bigger cities, particularly in South Africa, the 9 metros, are developmental. They are expected to facilitate more than just the mechanical delivery of services. They are the engines of our national economies, producing over 80% of the gross value added. And so it's key to define a safety role from them, as well as make sure that they are safe so that they can play a developmental role, especially in the global South, where cities are faced, well, our country in particular is faced with inequality. So cities are among our best bets of making sure that more and more of our people access sustainable livelihoods. And so cities are central, and that they are safe is essential. and why we advocate a focus, an urban focus, because one might ask, well, why not a focus on the rural, is that if you had to just look at the city's share of a lot of the big crime challenges, particularly the violent crimes, it's quite high. So of the 9 municipalities that we analyze and that we interface with in the Urban Safety Reference Group, who are home to about 40% of the national population, and that number set to rise in that by 2050, about 60% of the national population will be living in the 9 major cities, about 76% of car hijackings, 58% of residential robberies, and more shocking or concerning aggravated robberies at about 64%. And for that reason, we advocate, of course, and I think my previous colleagues have covered quite a lot of what we think is important. We stress that there need to be social, economic, and spatial responses, because the drivers of crime and violence are social, economic, and spatial. And so this is just our research framework when we drive the point around evidence that recognizes the structural drivers of violence and crime, in addition to approaches that are law enforcement based. I won't dwell too long on who the Urban Safety Reference Group is. I've touched on that. I'll move right along to some of the recognitions we've made about the nexus between crime, violence, safety, and the built environment. Mainly, it's that South African cities have a shortage in quality public space, and much of our public spaces are considered unsafe, whether perceived or real. Some of the issues that are prevalent in public space are homelessness, informal trade, and informal settlements, substance abuse, criminality, linked to and partly caused by broad structural problems, including spatial and socio-economic inequality, poverty, and unemployment. So a lot of interventions needing to be honed in and focused on those particular realities that we face in our public spaces, that women, girls, and the LGBTQ and all vulnerable in our cities are uniquely vulnerable in public space, with crime and fear undermining their use, movement, and enjoyment of public spaces, and they are reaping of the urban dividends. So the benefit of living in cities, a lot of the vulnerable are prejudiced in their ability to access cities freely. And while policy does link to public space, and does link space to safety, the roles and responsibilities and mechanisms of administrating public space and promoting safety are not detailed and clear enough. So we advocate for pushing for a clear articulation of what the operationalization of proper operationalization of public space at the local level should be, and pushing more and more for realizing that some of the structural problems around safety are also historical, structural. So really recognizing the need for a decolonial view of public space, thinking more actively about what the African meaning and purpose of public space should be. Another important conversation that's emerging within the Urban Safety Reference Group, and a few cities engaged in some activities around clarification and understanding. And that while open space budgets, public space budgets are decreasing, you then need creative ways of emphasizing public space and its importance, and you need to unlock community resources as well as involve communities. And so again, this is just some data that links, that shows why you need a city's focus when it comes to crime and violence, and I'll move right along from there. But another thing that we had recognized as an Urban Safety Reference Group, and it's taken from global and also local research, is that space is a key driver of whether environments are safe or unsafe. So there are quite a few factors at play: the absence of capable guardians, so there's a human factor, motivated offenders, and in a situation of of poorly performing or not so inclusive urban economies, motivated offenders that drives that. You need suitable targets, you need crime facilitators, the absence of intimate handlers, and pro-crime spatial characteristics. So a framework that really recognizes the role of space, and that at the same time, public spaces are communal spaces. And so you need them to be designed and developed in such a way that it's responsive to where people work, where and how they live and play. So a big emphasis on the environmental factors as drivers of crime and violence, and how to engage with those. And when we think about safe public spaces, you need homegrown public space. And so something that is very context specific, and I think both of my colleagues who've spoken just before me emphasize this point. You need community participation, not consultation. And I'll go into some of the approaches and interventions instituted by some of our city members that really focus on the participation element, and that the local context is key, that you need integrated approaches. And so your public spaces must link to other public infrastructure and public investments such as human settlements and so on. And you need holistic interventions, activated public space where communities actively use, and there's a social function of public space as well. So just to go into some of the interventions and recognitions made by our member cities. So in the city of Johannesburg, in its development of its citywide safety strategy, looking at attaining or achieving a well-regulated responsive cities, there's a linkage between disaster and emergency management, environmental prevention, social crime prevention as inputs looking to have an impact on overall city safety. So you need a safe and secure urban environment and public spaces, as well as informed, capacitated and active communities. So really driving the point there around evidence and information. And so in terms of just other approaches where cities have tested deep participatory approaches to public space making. You have the N Street North Park example in the city of Johannesburg, also JP Park, some of the interventions that have been driven by cities together with technical partners like GIZ, such as the Park Activators Training, where you recognize that you need to drive and be intentional about unlocking the social function of space, and that you need agents and change agents within a park space to drive an activated public space. And so how could you perhaps leverage existing programs such as the EPWP program in a city to capacitate participants in the EPWP program to be park activators, and really pushing for social models of public space making. In terms of just some of the thematic work and capacity building and support that we have undertaken as the collective in support of our member cities, and in trying to highlight some of what they're doing for possible replication, adaptation in other contexts. We've done work around public space, community safety planning, recognizing the importance of co-creating together with communities, and so emphasizing the element around community engagement and creating a guide for city practitioners on how to successfully and effectively engage communities. Some of the recommendations that through our work on the particular theme of public space that we've come up with is that you need detailed local level and frequent safety audits with a holistic public space focus for context specific policy strategy and intervention. You need an emphasis on quality, deep participation, all of society approaches, so that you have impacts that are holistic and look at the overall driving down crime and violence, and you need a socio-economic focus. Localized implementation and place making and so-septed principles become important, and the interpretation of those for each context is quite important. You need innovation, creativity, co-creation, particularly in a context of less budgets, an ailing economy. You need to co-create for sustainability and community resilience. And COVID-19 has made this point so important, is that you need a focus on public sanitation and toilets. And when you think about vulnerability, when you think about women, children, LGBTQ, the delivery of those needs to be responsive to their needs, similar to informal settlements and so on. And that you also need structured mechanisms, and I think that's a shameless plug for ourselves, the Urban Safety Reference Group being a structured platform, is that you need structured mechanisms for collaboration, learning and exchange within and across municipalities to support the integration of public space planning into citywide development strategies, human settlements, implementation and so on. And thanking you for your time. I think I'll end it there. These are just some of our products that we've done that respond to some of what we've mentioned today. Thank you so much, facilitator.
Yeah, also, thank you very much for your presentation. This gave us a wide range of a lot of input that we would like to discuss now in the coming about an hour time that we have left. I would just like to remind you that I hope that you can see my screen now again, that you can place your questions right into the chat, as well as if you would like to speak, you can also raise your hand. What we would like to do now for the next couple of minutes, while you think of some of your questions, is that we would like to maybe look and kick off with some of the questions that I have prepared here for our discussions on the basis of our trigger inputs from all three speakers. And the first one here, and it's really to all of us, and please feel free to respond directly to that, is that I'd like to pick up again on what you have just mentioned, Spe, on how do we support more. You mentioned it, what's the African meaning of public spaces? And I believe that Tinus was also, as well as Michael, talking about how do we understand the macro context more. And I believe, and I think also based on little research that is done, that too often we actually look at the global north for the development and the use of public space. But the question would be, how do we actually support more homegrown initiatives? How do we unpack the African meaning of public spaces, for example, much more in detail? And here it is really about that public space mustn't be just a park or a green public tranquil public space, but it can also be a very bustling, noisy traffic node where people, including the informal sector, are actually selling their goods, etc. How do we then support more of these homegrown initiatives throughout South Africa? And the second question is that I'd like to pose is, and Tinus mentioned that in the beginning, at the end of his presentation, is how do we move from policy, as our topic of this conference is really at, but I'd like to pose it again. How do we move from policy making to evidence-based implementation? If we have the white paper, we have the ICVPS, we have a whole section in the thematic area of, for example, safety through environmental design, but how do we, and that brings also to the last question that I have here, how do we actually then make it stick to, let's say, focus on evidence-based implementation at an area-based level? And the third one is of involving, that has to do with the communities. We discussed, and all three of you said that crime prevention through environmental design, the built environment is one aspect that leads to safer communities, but there's also the social aspect, there's also the law enforcement aspect. But in this question, we need to look at how do we involve our communities more effectively and systematically to support with maintaining and using active public space. Maike was talking about using, for example, the urban acupuncture, and there was a picture that he showed us to where you decongest within an urban area, within an informal settlement. You talked about the issue of smart urbanism. Then Spee was mentioning also the use, for example, of the extended public works program to maybe focus to activate and to keep active public spaces. Here, for example, we have the whole issue around and the project on the park activators coordinators that we can use. How do we leverage more on that? We also to co-create. And lastly, how can we enhance institutionalization and how do we leverage the learnings? If we take, for example, our experiences from Kaya Richa, and what BPOU was working on for 15 years, but how do we then institutionalize this beyond? I believe we had a discussion about half a year ago with Temba Fossi when we launched the guides to designing integrated area-based violence prevention interventions, where we said these are all amazing and good practices, but how can we bring them beyond one or two or maybe three places within the South African space? So these are some of the questions that I would like to start with to discuss with you. I know this is quite a lot, and I hope that any one of you can start responding, actually, whoever wants to go. And we are also waiting for other questions, and then we go right into the discussion of with all our participants here today. Spee, you have raised your hand.
Yes, I wanted to just respond to your question before I lose my train of thought. I'll just take the one on the African meaning of public space. And I see, with your permission, facilitator, if I can just take one other that is directed to me in the chat, and then I'll hand over to the other colleagues. So with regard, I think it's quite important. I think you answered your own question, Thomas. You said that in a lot of cases, we tend to import models from other global contexts, particularly the global north, on what the meaning of public space is. So looking at things like tranquility, very sterile environments, and not to say that in Africa there is no place for public spaces that are like that, but there is so much more that public space can do and can unlock. There's an economic aspect to how public space is administered and understood, which would then inform how we approach and how we respond to the needs of say, informal traders, of which many are women, who are heading households and who are the only ones kind of bringing in an income and kind of giving everybody else in the household access to education, other life improving aspects as well. So you would have to think about how you make public space inclusive of those demographics and of those economic needs, without kind of having this hostile policing-based and cleanliness-driven response to public space. What you could do is perhaps come up with models of placemaking together with the users of those public spaces. Public spaces are also, in the African context, and I guess it differs place by place, but women are big users of public space in African cities and no differently in South Africa. However, they face quite a few exclusions. They also face, gender-based violence, harassment. So how do you make, and I think in my presentation, I mentioned one of the key challenges that we've picked up is that whether real or perceived, and I guess this goes into answering the next question, public spaces are considered to be unsafe, particularly for the vulnerable. That includes women and other groups. But how do you engage with social attitudes so that women can feel safe in public space? How do you implement public toilets so that women can use them safely? And their personal safety and bodily integrity is protected. How do you structure those in a context of higher levels of violence and crime in cities? How do you I think we would have to think very creatively about how we make cities safe for women. And I would say, and I guess this is a personal point to end on, is that if you can make cities safe for women and if you can make spaces safe for women and children, anybody else should be able to feel safe and comfortable there. So in thinking about what it means to have functional, effective, relevant spaces in the African context, I think there's lots of room to come up with many great and interesting ideas. So in terms of the question that's emerging from the chat, again, it's around expanding on the meaning of social activation of public spaces. I think Tendo, who has asked the question, it goes back to this concept and the fact rather that public spaces in South African cities are considered and are experienced to be unsafe. And so how do you turn the tide around? How do you invite communities back into public spaces? Because you have in some communities where public spaces lie fallow, they are not used effectively. The immediate communities fear to tread and to be there. So what mechanisms, what activities can you bring into these spaces that would make communities comfortable to come back into these spaces again and to use them, with the understanding that public space isn't public space for its own sake, but it has a social function. Public space is a key driver of social interaction in cities. And I think it's an expression and a reflection of society. And many key historical moments have taken place in public squares, and public libraries have a great purpose to serve in our societies. And so how do you activate and how do you bring about a sense of community ownership of those spaces is what we mean by social activation of public spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Spe, for going much deeper into some of the questions that were posted here, but also looking directly into the chat. I'm going to come back to the chat in a couple of minutes. In fact, I can't see it while I'm sharing my screen, but I'd like to give also Tinus and then also Michael afterwards a chance to respond to some of the questions that we posted here is some of our kickoff questions. Tinus, over to you.
Thanks very much to all the other presenters as well. I think we've complemented a lot of the things that we've all said support each other. So I wish I could answer your questions with real practical advice on how to change it, Thomas. Let's start with the first one. We look at the global north, and perhaps I should just get this off my chest, because most of you may know that I've been involved with this since the late 90s when we had the NCPS, the National Crime Prevention Strategy. And at the time, that was going to be the savior of the country in terms of creating safer communities. We know that it was a non-starter, but our research at the time was specifically specifically intended to deal with the pillar on crime prevention through environmental design at the time. And sad to say that all the issues that we are raising now were raised then, and a lot of things that I think that we could learn perhaps from that was that we did try to at least contextualize the concept of crime prevention through environmental design in its broadest definition, the broadest definition, not just looking at buildings and space, but looking at the interaction between people and the physical environment. We tried to at least contextualize it. And that's why I think we still have a good basis to work from. That's on the SaferSpaces website. Secondly, at the time, there was a lot of support for this from local government as well as the police. The police, in fact, partly funded the manuals that we wrote on crime prevention through environmental design. However, unfortunately, I think that drive and that interest got lost along the way. But I think what did work for us at the time was the training at local level, at municipal level, because a lot of the interventions that we look at, the environmental interventions, needs to be implemented by local government and not by the police. It needs to be municipal officials that do what they're supposed to do. If we just look at maintenance, we know that. So I think the first thing for us is I think we need to, again, create that excitement and that drive at a municipal level. I think we try, but I think it's fragmented. I think Cities Network is doing something, we're doing something, and we are not really, I think, really bringing this message across in a coherent way. Then very briefly, just on the issue of, yes, African open space, perhaps, I think, and you did mention it, that it's not the same everywhere. We must also be careful not to think, well, at least we've now done it, it's now for Africa. It does not work like that. Even communities differ. We know that we've had in the past in our work found where people would say, I would rather not have that open space, but use it to live, to build my house, because at the moment I do not have a space to build my house. So we must also really look at it at a context-specific way, really local level context, and not just it must be Africanized or whatever we want to call it, decolonized. It is really, really important to understand the local context, and I think we all agree on that. I've got a few other things, but let me give, I see Michael has also had his hand up for a while, so I'm going to stop now, Thomas, and we'll speak again perhaps later.
Thanks, and we'll engage later on a couple of more questions that just triggered as well as me, for myself. So Michael, over to you for a first reaction.
Thanks very much, Thomas, and thanks very much for the questions. Very helpful questions, very big questions, and broad questions. I think there was I really liked the comment in the chat from one of the colleagues, which I want to rephrase. Are we building cities for the standard's sake, or are we building cities for citizens? And that's really, if we want to have a little bit more the homegrown, sorry, Thomas, can you bring back the questions if you don't mind? Can you bring back how can we work on the homegrown? I think we have to, those local initiatives are quite important. And just I encourage a little bit more innovation and taking the risks. So one of the things that has worked for us very well, which we, by the way, also working with the GIZ in the sprint meeting, is to have a community development fund or social development fund. So there you can start some innovation right at the bottom and work with that innovation. And sometimes it is public space, as we said, is not necessarily a park or a big plaza. Sometimes it's the meat market. Think around informal traders and how informal traders occupying public space, how they use the public space, how they can be allies in making public spaces safer because they utilize it. And there's many of those examples. So I think there's a lot of homegrown initiatives that we can piggyback on and that I encourage us to work. Second thing for me is around, if you talk about the evidence-based implementation, that's really, where do we find our allies? Where do we build our guiding coalition? We have been quite fortunate in our work that we often had those guiding coalitions, be it within the city, with the area coordinating teams where different departments sit together and look about a particular geographic location that assists, be it in a province where we have a sister project with the ASAP project, where the province scaled elements of that, and where the Department of Health started to become a very strong ally through the whole of society approach. So I would like us to break the little bit the silos and look who are the unusual allies. I mean, health with public health is a very usual and a very common ally, but how does education work? How do other departments work? And how can we piggyback on them? I fully endorse what Siphelele said earlier on around using the extended public works. We use that extensively for the urban management and the place making. So there are possibilities, there are means and ways to link to government as well. But for me, is one of the key elements is, in order to have our African or homegrown initiatives, don't follow the norms and standards of the North. Find and define, and I think that's what we're doing on a daily basis, define norms and standards that are appropriate. I think that is one of the levers we need to trigger now. The norms and standards are designed not necessarily for an African context. So we actually constrained in the expression of the African public spaces and African design for it. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks also, Michael, for that first reaction. And it really triggers the whole question around the EPWP that many of you mentioned, and maybe to bring this in relation and to link this with the local level and local government implementation. And Tinus, you mentioned it, to kind of like create this excitement again at the local level for them to integrate and to you said in your words to do what they're supposed to be doing, but I think that also leads and needs something what we keep on discussing also within the GIZ BCP program around the issue of professionalization within local government officials. And I'm not talking here about the Urban Safety Reference Group, where we do have a lot of local government officials that are extremely capacitated and professionalized, but how do we support then rather maybe also smaller municipalities or ICMs with making sure that they're not left behind and they also understand the need for integrated and holistic violence and crime prevention interventions within an area-based focused. And going back to the EPWP, to say how can we kind of like make local government responsible or using the EPWP meaningfully for the activation of public space, but also for making sure that when we look at urban acupuncture, these places are used in a way that are conducive to safe and accessible public space. I would like to go back into the chat. I finally found it here also to have access to the chat while we are still presenting and sharing my screen. And I'd like to start with Lizo Kagwe's question from the Eastern Cape, where he asks, and where his big question is that we all know that apartheid spatial design are more conducive to unsafe spaces, especially to African communities, including the homelands. And how in the long term, and that is his question, how in the long term will these spaces be changed, and whether it's actually advisable to still develop them to conform to the norms and standards for safer spaces? That's a very particular question. It's also looking into the more maybe rural areas within South Africa, where we also have a lot throughout South Africa, not only in the Eastern Cape. Anyone? Could be Tinus?
Maybe I can start. It is a difficult question to answer, but I think there are a few things to look at. Let me start at the end of the sentence, where conform to norms and standards for safer spaces. I don't think there is such a thing as a set of norms and standard for safer spaces. That's the first thing. I think what we are looking at, and now I'm talking about even the examples that we've seen. I mean, the VPUU has got extensive examples, and I'm also always grateful that they're actually doing it, because they're implementing some of the things that the CSR as an organization can't. We're a research organization, so I can see what it looks like. But so we can look at it there, but from our perspective as the CSIR, we have some guidelines, and I'm sure some of the others have got guidelines, which means they have to be applied in a context-specific way. So I don't think we have to, I can call it, worry about norms and standards that will be forced upon us. That's the one thing. So I think what we can do is we can look at the principles and the objectives that we want to achieve and apply them even in rural areas. I think we should not really look at it as something that only happens in a built-up urban area. They are applicable. So that's the one aspect of the question. The other aspect about the legacy of the apartheid spatial structuring, I think we all agree that that is still in some cases a problem, even in cities where we have the buffer zones, which become no man's land, which become areas where people have to traverse and still, be exposed to criminal activity. And I think we do have the same, but for that purpose, there are other very good documents in the country. Even if you look at something like the Integrated Urban Development Framework, the IUDF, if you look at some of the human settlements policies, they are also applicable in more rural areas. But again, the question is, who needs to do that? And that is, I think, where it falls off the table. There's a document that was developed by the Department of Human Settlements with us called the Red Book, the Neighborhood Planning and Design Guide, where a lot of these principles that are really just good design and urban planning are explained. But the question remains, someone needs to do it, and who is that? And that's where I think where we struggle as crime prevention practitioners. So sorry, not an answer, but I think one can take this discussion further. And I just want to mention, Thomas, I don't know if you can see the hands, there are some hands up from people as well. I'm not sure if you can see it from previous hands.
I actually cannot see that. Lauren, could you please assist me with hands that are up so that we can take some of the hands before we...
has had a hand up for quite some time.
Please, then go ahead.
Good day, everyone. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I think my question comes from the more the space that I work in, because I work in a prison space. The original design of prison was for oppression, for containment, and for housing. So the history of the apartheid's idea of what prison is versus what correctional centers in democracy is there. And I believe that design of buildings still exists in public spaces. So I'm building my framework around that our current design of buildings are made with seen and unseen spaces, and community space and open space or public spaces are inherently built with both seen and unseen spaces. I'm thinking on how taxi ranks and communities are formed by communities themselves, and civil society, public, private, state, when they build taxi ranks, they build them usually out of sight because not always are they seen as desirable. But when they design them, they're never built with the idea of scene spaces so that everybody becomes active agents of crime prevention. Because I know from my space that if everybody sees what's happening, violence does not happen because people don't want to be seen doing bad things. It's only very antisocial people that will do bad things in open spaces. So it's curious to see how all the presenters are speaking around this open spaces and public spaces, but I'm curious to see where's the overlap. Where do we get together and start physically building these spaces? Because communities kind of need it. Even prisons need it, but where the technology, the research are there, but the active participants who can build it are missing. So maybe the researchers have projects or there is real world applications. I know there's in smaller areas, there are applications, but I'm just wondering, what are we missing? Where's the bigger role players, the financial role players to make this a working space? That's my question.
Thanks very much, Hannes, for that question. I would like to give that question actually, in fact, to the practitioner first, to Michael, before we go into the two researchers to respond and to act or to respond to your question. Michael, can you start?
Yes, I can try. Hannes, thanks very much. I think it's a very relevant question that we're posing. And it's really, how do we design spaces that they are less conducive to crime? And it's really the center of the conversation we're having here today. I liked your approach of layering, what you said. So I see a lot of answers in your question already. If you work with your question, that layering of different services, that activation, that working together in a collaborative. There are some examples. I invite you to come to Kailicha. I didn't show that example because it's a well-known and published example, the Harare case, for instance, where we reduced murder by up to 60%, and UCT confirmed to us over a 3-year study that through the crime prevention, through environmental design, plus the social activation, plus the different usage, and I think that's what it is. It's one of the things, how do we mix the users, the different users across the day, across the week, but also across the activities. And UCT came back and said after 3 years, you actually, with the likelihood that you get attacked in those public spaces that are developed is 40% less than the rest of Kailicha. And that's profound. The other profound result that they came back with was that the mental health situation, particularly of women, had increased because of the intervention. And it's really a mixture of the 3-4 things. It's the built environment or the physical environment and how you cluster it. And I think there's a lot of opportunities there. And it was a hard fight to have a library that includes an ECD center, that includes offices for business support, that includes a public space surrounding it, and that is not fenced in, which you can easily access. And just by providing that, instead of providing a fortress, you provide an inviting building. The whole narrative changes of the public space. Are we building, I mean, you started with prisons. Are we building prisons around our public spaces? And if we look at some of our public facilities, they pretty much look like a prison. Or are we developing inviting buildings? And make sure that the local community takes ownership of that, because that's your best protection service, if I can put it that way. So that's my part of the answer is there are examples, they are scalable, they require a multi-sectoral approach to it. And they require that we move away from the apartheid thinking, and lots of the norms and standards still advocate the apartheid thinking. And that is I'm coming back to the point that was raised earlier from the colleague from the Eastern Cape. It's exactly that. Speak to the local community, what needs to be changed, and then implement it. Sometimes ignore norms and standards. Define them, redefine them. That's the only way innovation starts. Start small, have those piloting things, and then scale it. What we did, and that's a response to the initial question, one good example is to sometimes take it head on. We worked in a rural setting, a small town, 17,000 people, and you have the high road, the activity spine. Guess where the activity spine is in rural communities? It's in the white and the privileged area. We shifted that by 90 degrees and said, actually, the activity spine goes straight into what's called the township. In this particular case, it's going up the hill. And first you got your white community, then you got your colored community, then you got your black community, and then right at the top, you got your foreigners, your migrant labor. And we basically connected all of them and said, this is the new avenue. And you put activities along there to make it safe for people to walk home, but also to have activities. And I think that's the narrative where we need to be bolder. Instead of re-emphasizing what has been there, we have to find new ways. And it's probably also a hint how we should do how we should develop rural development. Make sure if you invest, it's mixed use and it's utilized and there's an operation maintenance concept. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael, for that. Can I have also Spay and Tinus to respond to that question, please?
Yes, I think, yeah, I've been fortunate today. I think all of the other speakers articulate a lot of what I'm thinking as well. I think Michael just hit the nail right on the head. So from a city's perspective, I think I would go back to the point around, and I think it's one that Michael has made as well, around co-creation, around innovation, around partnership, partnering with communities, and driving that point around deep participation. I think that is where you then have interventions that are sustainable and that drive community resilience as well. Just in terms of some of the key challenges around that, and that's not to oversimplify or suggest that participation just goes without saying and that it just happens. It is quite complex. It's not something that happens almost automatically. Different city administrations exist in various contexts. Ones in some cases, for example, where their relationship with the community is not ideal and it doesn't give itself to an open flow of exchange and communication. You have perhaps one city that struggles with gangsterism, and so the city doesn't have much legitimacy in terms of its ability to go into communities. So how do you structure a constant flow of exchange and information and consultation and engagement there is quite important. Just to go back to some of what we found from a research point of view through our constant engagement with the city practice space and city practitioners, is that I think similar to what was said by Tinus earlier, is that you have communities that are already quite resilient already. I think similarly within a municipal space, you have mechanisms for partnering and collaboration that are already existing. One of the key challenges is that they just need to be institutionalized. So what you currently have in a lot of contexts, in a lot of city authority contexts, is that you have small coalitions of the willing, of practitioners who recognize the need to partner and come together, but they are not institutionally backed, in that there are challenges in then allocating budget and justifying it within your KPAs of why you would be involved in such an initiative, and hence the point around institutionalization becomes critical. So in some of the park examples that I mentioned before, what made them successful, and it stands to be seen whether they'll be successful in a sustainable way in terms of the management of those park spaces, is the partnership. So you had the public safety unit partnering with the city, the development agency of the city, together with the planning unit of the city, together with other non-state partners as well, including GIZ, VCP, Sticky Situations, and others, to come up with models of engagement, to come up with models of sustaining the delivery. And they were able to overcome some of the institutional barriers. And I think that really drives home the point around you need a great push for institutionalizing some of the more progressive interventions and ways of doing, because what's needed is also a great shift in how we do things. And I think I must definitely echo Michael when he says sometimes you must abandon norms and standards, and where we've seen and where we've found that something interesting, innovative has come up is exactly where practitioners have kind of deviated from norms and standards, of course, as far as they can. But what you do need is institutionalization in a way where the system itself also rewards collaboration. Right now, it's kind of the way KPAs are structured, the way delivery is structured, it's by components, it's by silos, and the system rewards exactly that individualistic approach to our jobs. And it shows itself in how it manifests in our public spaces, where human settlements are not integrated with other public inputs and investments, and that individualism kind of replicates itself across the system. And in what you see when you then have communities kind of rejecting some of the things that are delivered because they don't speak to their needs. We said we wanted a clinic, you've brought us a park, you know? So there's a whole universe of things and issues to interact with and kind of rationalize. And I think central to that is partnership, interdepartmental partnership within a city administration, and that city administration kind of coming up with a sound approach as to how it's going to be constantly communicating, informing, participating and partnering with communities, so that whatever that is implemented is sustainable and it anchors community resilience.
Thank you very much for that. In the interest of time, I hope, Tinus, that we can go to other questions that came up in the chat, and I'd like to just refer into the chat again. There are a couple of comments, and thanks also for our colleagues for already answering some of the questions right into the chat. Spey, you've triggered two other issues that I'd like to go into just in a minute, which is around the KPA as well as on the budget. And budget issue is something that I'd like to go much more in detail just now. But before that, I would like to give Siyabulela Monakali the opportunity to just maybe also phrase his question that you posted in the chat. If that is okay, would you like to speak to it directly? Otherwise, I can read it and then we can jointly find responses from our input givers. Siyabulela,
Yes.
over to you.
Am I audible?
You are, perfect.
Yes. I work for an organization called Ilita Rabando. It is an organization that was established in 1989 in the township of Kokoleto. And with regards to the issue of crime and violence, the organization specifically addresses the issue of violence against women and children. We offer various services, including psychosocial support, also legal advice with regards to the issue of gender-based violence and femicide. Now, the question that, or it's actually just a broad statement that kind of leads to a question. It's just something that I've always wondered working in this space, because we work primarily, we give primarily assistance to survivors of violence, not necessarily just gender-based violence, because the issue is that, you know, when you find that a community has high rates of crime and violence, you know, women and children often always suffer the most in those communities, because there's a greater sense of lawlessness. Now, when you look at a community like Gugulethu, Nyanga, and Gugulethu, Nyanga, and Langa, those are primarily like one of the oldest townships here in the Western Cape. Now, when we want to talk about development and infrastructure and so forth, you know, we also work in Khayelitsha. And when I visit Khayelitsha, you know, every time I visit Khayelitsha, there's always something new that I see in that community, whether it is a hospital. Langa and Nyanga and Gugulethu don't necessarily have hospitals. And, you know, because of the space within these communities, it's very congested in Gugulethu, it's very congested in Nyanga in particular. I think that one is the worst, and also in Langa. Now, when we want to talk about, you know, the issue of apartheid spatial planning, I think especially within these communities, they are more, you know, harshly affected by it, because, you know, what we find is that the land that was, say, vacant maybe 10 to 15 years ago, here in Gugulethu in particular, now has been taken up by various informal settlements within this area. There's an area called Barcelona. I think with each year, you will see how much it actually extends and extends. And I think last year there was, or 2 years back when there was a fire, they did a drone video, where they put a drone up to see where the fire starts. And to my, you know, I was so surprised at how far reaching and how, you know, in terms of the landmass that area actually covers, because I drive past that area every day. You know, my issue is that now when we have communities, these communities in particular, now we want to talk about building resilient communities with, proper infrastructure to build communities that are safe. Where would we actually begin within these particular case studies? Because even from my own perspective, you know, I don't see a way forward, you know, with regards to these communities, or what, because they are also elderly people who have been waiting, you know, for housing, you know, for many years, and there is unfortunately a huge backlog, and within these communities there's no land. Now, within that context, what do we do? Do we then look like, how do policy practitioners, how does government and private sector, how then do they look at this particular issue and then tell themselves, you know, what is the way forward? Because it's very mind-boggling when you look at it from a developmental perspective as to how we can make these communities, Gugulethu, Nyanga, Langa, how do we then move these communities and make them more resilient? So, you know, especially when it comes to the issue of crime, Nyanga has been, for the past decade, has been rated the murder hotspot, you know, in South Africa, you know, consistently every single year, with the amount of murders and crimes that happen within that area. And you look at how congested that community is. So basically it was more of a broad statement I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, Bulila. Thanks very much for that very important, I believe, statement. There were a couple of comments right into your question and statement. One from Michael saying that let's actually go multi-story. I believe that VPU has some good practices on that, and they're working in Nunu and as well as in Lotus Park. There was also another question, and then I'd like to hand it over to our input givers. From Liso Kruger, that went directly into your comment or statement, is that he doesn't see any new cities and residential designs that are free from racial divide. Is there any research paper on this racial-free cities and residential spaces? Thanks for that, Liso. And can I give this to Tinus to start responding? Just mindful of time, we have about 15 minutes left for our discussion, and we would like to really go a little bit into the whole issue around budgeting still. Thanks.
Thanks, Thomas. Thomas, would you like me to specifically respond to that last comment that you made, or?
To both, from Siabulela, from his statement, as well as to Liso's last statement, if you like.
Okay. Yeah, I think both of them both are very tricky issues to deal with. And I think what I can, the main thing that I can say is that I actually support what Michael has said about when you struggle with space and when you struggle with finding place where people can build and people can create their open spaces. I do think that you need to, as Michael calls it, you need to think creatively. So I don't think I can add much more to that. It's a very specific issue in Cape Town, which unfortunately is not my own city, or fortunately, I don't know. And then, regarding new cities or neighborhoods that still demonstrate the racial divide, I think based on the work that we also do in our group on human settlements in general, and not just crime prevention, it is a situation that we just find difficult to deal with from a research perspective, because again, all the policy documents are there. We have, from the Department of Human Settlements, we are breaking new ground, which is their sort of policy document. We have, even from the very first 1994-95 white paper on housing by Joe Slovo, it has been promoted everywhere, and in fact, more than promoted. It's almost not enforced, but it's there for the taking. And why it happens like in the way that it is happening is very difficult to explain. I think we have to, in this case, look at issues around, obviously, affordability, but that is not enough for us to explain why we still struggle with the apartheid structure. And I wish I had the answer, but I cannot honestly tell you how we change it, because the policy is there. If someone does not implement a policy, it's almost, I want to say, beyond the reach of the people who have to just build a new development. Having said that, though, I do think that when it comes to the new developments, I think money talks, and developers and politicians and officials obviously in the end looks at where can we get the most bang for our buck. And we struggle with the same situation over and over again, where the developments are not integrated, but they're put on the periphery of the city. So it's difficult for me to say how you change it. I just can confirm that it has to change.
Thanks, Tinus. Can we give that, is there any other further input into that from Spe and from Michael?
Please go ahead, Michael.
Okay, thanks. I've given my comments in the chat section. I think Nyang has it's a perfect laboratory to actually test and implement the white paper on safety and security. I've put it there. It's possible. That's what you want. You want to have a dense city, now make it safe. So the ingredients are there, multi-story mixed use. It's all possible. It's just a long way to imagine that. But I encourage to work through local structures and sit around the table and come up with interesting plans. So what we're busy with the city right now in Yanga, for instance, is to analyze all the little parks and the pocket parks in Yanga. Because as Siabulela said, a lot of the land has been basically taken up, occupied. So how can you make parks safer? And I think his organization is one of the organizations that looks at has taken a partnership with one of the local parks. Thanks. The examples are there. The laboratory is working.
From my side, I would think, in addition to what the other colleagues have said, I don't know, I just want to cotton on the aspect that came up, but we didn't spend too much time on it, on ECD, so early childhood, the early childhood development aspect, and how could you marry that with interventions that want to unlock safer public spaces. And I think it's all about a developmental approach in the long term, where at the same time that you are targeting children for teaching about social attitudes as well, in terms of how they then carry themselves in the public as public citizens as well. You leverage early childhood development centers as centers of learning, not only just about social attitudes, but about driving certain consciousness about public space, and how could early childhood centers be extensions of public space in the same way that you would want human settlements to integrate into public spaces as well. So really creating a holistic world where public space links to where people work, where people learn, where you incorporate the ideas about what to teach and what to learn there as well. So I think from a city's perspective, again, really unlocking those local level relationships within a city. How do early childhood education isn't the mandate of local government, but what are the inputs from a local government mandate perspective could a city be involved with that makes sure that you have quality ECD? Similarly, how does a planning department come together with the public spaces department, be it a parks and zoo in the context of the city of Johannesburg, linking together with the development agency of the city, linking together with the department that is responsible for approvals in the city for ECD, so that they can together push for one vision that really leads to an integrated city where public spaces aren't just thought of in isolation, but they link to everything else. They link to public transport. They link to education and health. And I think I mentioned something in the chat here about a very interesting article that I was reading that suggests an approach to crime and violence as a public health issue. So what if you treated violence as an infectious disease? And in some contexts globally, that has, in the city of Glasgow, they are saying that approach has slashed crime and violence rates by up to 60%, particularly murders. So really, it's a whole of society, a holistic view and a holistic approach. Maybe I would suggest that public spaces incorporated with everything else that is supposed to make a city a success.
Yeah, thanks, Bea. And that's exactly what we've spoken earlier about on the role of local government, of an integrated approach to violence and crime prevention initiatives, to make sure situation analysis is done, to make sure safety audits are done, to know and local government is best placed for doing that, to understand and to fully know what are some of the risk factors. And you talk about ECD, for example, to make sure we go into the right places, we make sure that we put the right programs in place within ECDs, for example, in a particular neighborhood. Colleagues, we have about less than 10 minutes left, in fact, and I wanted to just trigger one bigger question around the issue of budgeting, which I think is very important. So when we look at some of the infrastructure grants that national government provides us with, and I'm sure that we have some colleagues also from national government here that may please also come in if you like. For example, we have the Neighborhood Development Partnership Grant from the Neighborhood Development Partnership Program from National Treasury. We have rather for the smaller, for the ICMs, the intermediate city municipalities, the IODG grant from the IODF. We have also the informal settlement upscaling grant. These grants, using them effectively and using them more in a sense of supporting violence and crime prevention, is something that we strongly believe we haven't tapped into as much as we should. And my question is, what is your take? And please, this can go also beyond our input give us. What does it take, and how do we make them more in a way that contribute to building safer communities, to building more resilient communities? What's your take? Anyone? Tinus, Michael?
Maybe I go because I haven't muted since last, sorry, for the potential noises. I think Francois put a good comment to that in the chat. If you scroll back a little bit, it's almost like looking, are we putting safety in the center, or is safety a byproduct or an intended outcome, an intended consequence of our working? So I think the safety conversation needs to go into each of the line department and the area basis so that one discusses it there. What is my contribution as social development to either safe or unsafe spaces? And I think then we are at the right trajectory. Rather than looking for dedicated budgets, make it part of that and be the champion for that. Thanks.
Yeah, I can, Thomas, I can just, yeah, I can just concur, because I think for many years, there's always been some or other funding source that could be utilized in the way it's supposed to, in the way it's intended to, that would also have crime prevention impact. And we support that, and we've supported that for many years, that use whatever is available. Because if you do that, if you upgrade an informal settlement and you do it in a way where you're cognizant of the crime prevention byproducts that you can have, you can make use of funding for normal work. So let's call it normal work, and you can have a crime prevention or crime reduction, at least, byproduct from it. So we support the idea of making use of whatever funding is available out there. And at a local government level, the same thing. You don't always have to find additional funding. I'm going to say it again. Yep. If a department is doing what it's supposed to be doing, it could also really create safer environments. And we've done many projects where we've tried to indicate to the different departments what your role, your normal role that you're supposed to do, how you can integrate crime prevention into that. And I think that is still valid if you just think about it with a slightly different perspective. You will also understand how the work that you do and that you may have funding for, infrastructure grants, can really contribute to creating safer communities.
From my end, definitely echoing what the other colleagues have said, but I think I'll draw on the example I mentioned earlier of leveraging perhaps the EPWP program, which is a wonderful intervention that is not explicitly about safety, but you could leverage that for safety outcomes. So how can cities better collaborate, engage with their public works units on how they can use that grant funding? And there are additional grant opportunities available within that program that can be leveraged for safety programs. So the Park Activators program is just one example of how you could leverage something that is not explicitly about safety for safety outcomes. There's the opportunity to do that in other senses as well. I think within the Treasury, there is the Neighborhood Development Program, which also has some grant that can be that can be leveraged for programs that, even if they are not explicitly about safety. And I think that's true of most things that happen in a city, and where we've come in is to identify the safety role of departments that don't necessarily have a consciousness of themselves as having a role and an input in safety. So there's a lot that happens within planning where you could build a safety consciousness or plan around safety outcomes from the outset. So quite a lot of grant opportunities that we ourselves have been working to pool and identify and see how we can tap into. And we are looking forward to updating on how we've done. So we are looking to collaborate with another platform of the SACN, that is the EPWP reference group, and looking to collaborate together to see how we could leverage some of the available funding. And I think I must definitely agree with Tinus in that it's not always a case of getting additional funding that is specifically for safety programs from Treasury, but leveraging. So it goes back to the point I was making around institutionalizing some of these partnership and partnered approaches, opening up the channels for co-creation and collaboration among the departments in a city first, and then opening that up, and that co-creative, collaborative approach to the wider community in terms of an all of society approach, but you begin also with an all of government approach. Yeah, I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Spe. In fact, thank you very much all of your colleagues for your inputs and your comments and your really interesting discussions. This has, our session has come to an end. And before we actually close, in fact, I would like us to go back on the Mentimeter, where we would like to pose the question on what is your major takeaway from this session here today. So please go on menti.com and put in the code again, 19545316. What is your major takeaway from this session here today? And while we are busy with that, I would like to firstly say again, thank you very much to your vibrant participation and inputs and comments that you've posted into the chat, as well as that you've posted directly to our colleagues. But a special thanks, of course, also to Tinus, to Spe, and to Michael for your trigger input, as well as your vast knowledge that you have on building safer and more resilient communities in South Africa. We would like to also say our thank you to the CSPS as well as to Savi for hosting this session. We, as I said, and as we said it in previous sessions within this conference, the SaferSpaces is an interactive platform run by and for community safety and violence prevention practitioners in South Africa to connect, to share knowledge and learn from each other. So please visit the platform for more information. And if you like, you can also sign up for the newsletter on SaferSpaces or even become a member of the SaferSpaces portal, while the major takeaways here fly in from the session. So thank you very much. It is exactly 11 o'clock, and we would like to end this session here today, and we look also forward to our next session, which will be on growing up in South Africa, safety in childhood and young adulthood, which will be moderated by Lauren, who is also part of this session here. We look forward to that session as well. Colleagues, thank you very much, everyone, and I hope that you also enjoyed the session, and you have a good day further, and all the best for the rest of the conference today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Thomas, for hosting this in such a professional way.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks,
Thank
Thomas.
you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thomas.
Bye, Lisa.
Are you able to hang back for like 10 seconds? I have a quick question, please.
Sure.
I'll just hang out. Yeah, I was gonna WhatsApp you, but I thought while I have you here, let's quickly catch up.
Wait, we are still recording.
Yeah.
No,
WhatsApp. Okay. Bye-bye.
I was about to say that.
It's like, hey, don't skinner.